Hello and welcome to the first episode of It's Old News 250. In this series, we'll be looking at newspaper articles that occurred 250 years ago. I basically have access to five colonial newspapers at the time: one in Hartford, Connecticut, one in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, one in Charleston, South Carolina, one in Annapolis, Maryland, and the other one is in Virginia. Um, as you may know, we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. And in fact, in the next 2 weeks is the 250th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party. I thought this would be the perfect time to start to kind of learn this history. I'm in no means an expert at all. A lot of this is going to be new news to me as well, and want to share it with you, and hopefully whoever views this finds it interesting as well, and we'll see where it goes. Each week I plan on showcasing some of the news that occurred in these five newspapers in the past week, pick out some of the most interesting stories, and starting off with some good stories that basically are leading right up to the Boston Tea Party. And let's get started. Boston, October 18th, 1773. A Boston merchant received an order for some chests of tea from a correspondent of his in Philadelphia. But before the order could be shipped, the correspondent canceled the order, basically stating that it would inevitably be destroyed if an ounce of it was known to be brought into that city. Um, Colonists in pretty much all of the colonies um, all basically agreed to not allow any importation of teas from England, or even to let it land in their ports if possible, um, based on this duty that they placed on the tea of 3 pence per pound, um, which they did to essentially try to raise a revenue from the colonists without their permission. So they all essentially signed a non-importation agreement, all unanimously agreeing to um, not allow any importation of tea into any of the colonies. And so this merchant here knows how the people feel and decided that he didn't want to import any tea, as likely any money he'd spend on it would be destroyed. Uh, and this kind of quote kind of speaks for itself here in how the people felt. A notable evidence this is of the spirit of our Philadelphian brethren, and you may venture to assure them that they will find no importers, factors, or any other sell-interested wretches here at this day, hardy enough to make a new experiment on the temper of the people. So, back over in Boston, the talk of the town in the past week has been that these five men, Richard Clark and his son, Benjamin Faneuil, and the two sons of the Massachusetts Bay governor, Thomas Hutchinson, were all chosen to be consignees of the tea and to sell the teas in their shops to the other colonists. And basically, uh, these people became kind of like the enemies of the people in Boston due to this. Um, Now, here, the same article kind of talked about if the tea now shipping for Boston were to be returned to England, as it undoubtedly will, and if the people insist on copying the resolutions of Philadelphia and New York of destroying the tea if it were to land, then Lord North will find it impossible to resist the resulting demand from the East India Company of repealing the Tea Act. Lord Frederick North, if you aren't aware, He was the Prime Minister of England from 1770 to 1782. Um, so he kind of inherited a mess. 1770 kicked off with the Boston Massacre, and 1773, the Boston Tea Party, and as we all know, in 1776, the American Revolution. And he remained prime minister pretty much all throughout the Revolutionary War. Ended in 1783, so he slightly resigned or was made to leave before that due to how badly the war went. Next story. So we saw this here. This was interesting because this puts another light on the whole incident and how uneasy this whole Tea Act made people. We learned from London that the late intention of the East India Company of sending Bohea tea to the colonies had created so much uneasiness and opposition among the merchants and others trading to America that it was uncertain whether any would be shipped. So even the merchants and the people shipping the tea on their boats over to the colonies knew how the colonists felt about this Tea Act and was uneasy about even sending it on their ships, knowing that it likely wouldn't be looked on favorably or even allowed to land. Also in the same article, unrelated to the tea, but I also found interesting, as it definitely showed signs that Britain was already looking to increase their troop levels here in the colonies due to the resistance the colonists have been giving England lately. A new barracks in Boston. It is positively asserted, said to be from good authority, that barracks would be built or the foundation for barracks laid on Fort Hill before July next. This is a colonial map of Boston I have here, and you can see Fort Hill down there at the bottom. Looking at a modern map of Boston, I made a kind of a rough estimate of where Fort Hill would have been back then, and it looks to be right around here. Milk Street and Oliver Street were both streets that existed back in colonial Boston, and is right around the area where Fort Hill was. I'm going to try to show stuff like this as much as possible to kind of look at what the city was like back in 1773 compared to how the cities look now in modern Boston, and hope over time to even build some maybe 3D models or something to kind of illustrate this better if I can. Boston, November 11th, 1773. Town meeting about the tea. On Friday last, there was a very full meeting of the freeholders and other inhabitants of this town in Faneuil Hall, agreeable to as notification of the selectmen. Now, Faneuil Hall was the major meeting house of the day back in 1773. All of the town meetings and important business was conducted here at Faneuil Hall. And this building is still intact today and still stands in Boston. Here it is in modern Boston today. I find it fascinating that some, many historical buildings like this still stand in a modern city and have been preserved. The Honorable John Hancock was chosen moderator, and the town, after due deliberation, came into the following resolutions. Whereas an act of the British Parliament passed in the last session allows the East India Company in London to export their teas into America, the act also imposes a duty of 3d on every pound of tea. Resolved, that the sense of this town cannot be better expressed than in the words of certain judicial resolves lately enacted by our worthy brethren in Philadelphia. Basically, in the past 2 weeks from this date, in 1773, the Philadelphia Council passed a series of resolutions that essentially unanimously agreed to not allow any importation of tea into the city of Philadelphia, and the Bostonians here are saying that they feel the exact same way. And other sentiments have been expressed in New York City and in South Carolina. Um, so basically, all of the colonies feel this same way about the tea duty. In the following, gentlemen, the moderator Henderson Inches, Benjamin Austin, and Jonathan Mason, and the selectmen of the town were appointed a committee accordingly. Whereas the merchants of this continent did enter into an agreement to withhold the importation of teas until the duty is repealed, and this was the non-importation agreement that I was speaking about earlier, that basically all of the merchants from the different colonies agreed to. The agreement, as we are informed, has been upheld by the southern colonies, while a small amount, when compared to the usual amount before the agreement, have been imported by some of the merchants here. It is now apparent that the British administration had been encouraged by these small importations to grant licenses to the East India Company. So basically, the agreement was upheld by the southern colonies in South Carolina and Virginia, but some of the merchants in Boston, these 5 men that we discussed a bit earlier, and likely others, allowed some importations of the tea and tried to sell them. And this encouraged Lord North to convince the East India Company to send more tea in massive quantities, essentially. Resolved that it is the determination of this town by any means in their power to prevent the sale of tea exported by the East India Company, which, as we know, eventually leads to the Boston Tea Party. The merchants here have generally opposed this measure. It is the expectation of the inhabitants of this town that none of them will import any tea that is liable to the duty until the act is repealed. The town then adjourned until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, there was again a very full assembly. The committee reported that they have communicated the resolve of the town to Richard Clark and Son and Benjamin Faneuil, who are said to be factors for the East India Company, and were asked to immediately resign. But the gentleman informed the committee, since Thomas and Elisha Hutchinson were at Milton and not expected to return until Saturday evening, that they cannot give an answer to the town until Monday after consulting them. Basically, as you can see in additional meetings with them going forward, they were looking for any excuse they could to not resign their post or not give an answer to the town, as they probably stood to gain considerable money from the sale of the teas, and so it was in their benefit to keep it. Then another committee was chosen. Samuel Adams, William Molyneux, and Dr. Joseph Warren are to inform Richard Clark and Son and Mr. Faneuil that since they are not joint factors with the Hutchinsons, that they could determine for themselves, and an answer is expected immediately. A motion was made and another committee formed to go to Milton and inform the Hutchinsons of the request of the town and to resign their appointment. John Hancock, John Pitts, Samuel Adams, Samuel Abbott, Dr. Joseph Warren, William Powell, and Nathaniel Appleton were chosen. As you can see in this colonial map I have here, Milton isn't too far from Boston, so it made sense for them to try to go directly to the Hutchinsons and get an answer from them immediately. A letter was brought into the hall signed by Richard Clark and Son, Benjamin Faneuil for himself, and Joshua Winslow, a 6th man added to the list of consignees, which states that they cannot comply with their demands as they do not yet know the terms on the tea and whether they have a moral or pecuniary obligation to fulfill their role as factor. So here, after hearing that they were going to go to the Hutchinsons and they could no longer use that excuse, of stalling to wait for the Hutchinsons to return to Boston, they came up with another excuse as to why they can't comply with their demands, as they do not know the terms on the tea yet, which, in on one hand is reasonable, and on the other hand, definitely sounds to me like they were looking for any excuse they could. After the letter was read, the town unanimously voted that it was unsatisfactory and adjourned to await the report from the committee who went to Milton to meet with the Hutchinsons. The town met again on Saturday at Faneuil Hall to a very full house, and the committee reported that they were only able to meet with one of the Hutchinsons as the other one was not at Milton or Boston. A letter was read from Thomas Hutchinson that states he was not aware of any of the details about the tea except that he had reason to believe the brothers would be jointly consigned the tea, so therefore he cannot give an answer to the town at this time. It was then voted that the letters were daringly affrontive to the town, and the meeting was immediately dissolved. At the next meeting on Friday, printed handbills were passed out in the hall titled "The Tradesmen's Protest Against the Proceedings of the Merchants Relative to the New Importation of Tea," which was read at the request of the inhabitants. After the reading, one inhabitant openly declared he saw Charles Paxton, one of the customs commissioners, passing out the handbills on King Street. The tradesmen present went to a separate part of the hall to get a sense of the paper, and the question was asked of them if they acknowledged the paper. The answer was negative and passed unanimously. Also, by a unanimous vote, they declared their disavowal of the paper as being false, scandalous, and base, and their detestation of Charles Paxton and others who had distributed the papers, as well as E. Russell, who printed them. In the estimation of the town, there were at least 400 tradesmen at the meeting. So someone, they don't know, name who exactly, or I mean, they named that Charles Paxton was passing out the flyers and E. Russell printed them, but some, maybe many others as well, conspired to create this handbill to make it seem like the tradesmen were angry about the proceedings that were happening, to kind of discredit the council from passing these resolutions. And the tradesmen present, which 400 of them is a lot, all unanimously said, no, we know nothing about this. Last Thursday, there was another meeting at Faneuil Hall where another committee was formed to once again meet with Clark and Son, Faneuil, and the Hutchinsons about whether they will be resigning from consigning the tea, especially since a ship has recently arrived from London, and at this point they should be aware of what the terms on the tea are, so they should be able to give an answer now. But they replied to the town saying that they have not received any orders from the East India Company, but have learned that their friends in England have entered into general engagements on their behalf, mostly of a commercial nature, which puts it out of their power to comply with the town. It was voted unsatisfactory, and the meeting was dismissed. So now some of the tea commissioners were getting worried about these resolutions that were being passed and went to the governor. Last Friday, His Majesty's Council for this province met by summons from Governor Hutchinson to consider a petition of the tea commissioners in this town, praying to resign themselves and the property committed to their care to His Excellency in their honors as guardians and protectors of the people, and that measures may be directed to for the landing and securing the teas until the petitioners can be at liberty openly and safely to dispose of the same, or until they can receive directions from their constituents. We've got some rowdy citizens here on Wednesday evening, assembled before the house of Richard Clark, one of the tea commissioners, and huzzaed, upon which a musket was fired from the house among the populace, which so enraged them that they broke all of his windows. So, like, this one article here shows like how angry a lot of these citizens were becoming over this tea act and these 6 men who have now become enemies of the people in Boston, doing due to them not agreeing to resign their appointments of consigning the tea. Now, this I find puts another twist on the story, and really kind of, if all of this information was true, really reeks of shadiness and something that if I was one of the colonists and someone who bought and drank this tea, I would also be pretty angry about. A letter from London of a late date advises a gentleman here not to purchase any of the tea coming in, as the East India Company has vast quantities rotting in their warehouses. Another letter says 12 million pounds of tea has been rotting in East India warehouses for 7 years, which will be sent to us based on what we are receiving. Families in Newport quit tea. Newport, November 22nd, 1773. We are assured that 50 or 60 families who use tea in their houses for a long time have lately entirely restrained from that pernicious herb, and that numbers of others are on the point of abandoning the great disgraceful practice of tea drinking. So, due to this duty, this is having some side effects that's causing people who usually drank tea every day, probably for years, to completely abandon drinking it, in resistance of this tea act. Insect that feeds on rotting tea. Now, this story makes the news about the rotting tea even worse. As a most useful hint to tea drinkers, both bahia and green tea that has been kept a considerable time will breed an insect that looks like a fly that prefers tea leaves past its prime. The fact that the East India Company are so anxious to force their tea into this country, it is most probable that it is greatly damaged by those insects that they cannot sell it at home. If you were to examine a large, unbroken tea leaf, you will find it to be eaten like a moth does to cloth, which is why the tea that comes to this country is so fine, it having been broken on purpose to prevent the discovery of its age. So not only are they sending rotting tea that has been sitting in warehouses for 7 years to the colonies, it also is probably been infested with these insects that have ate the tea leaves. And to hide the fact of this, they've essentially broken the tea up into very fine pieces and shipped the tea that way. Pretty scummy. New York, November 22nd, 1773. Native Americans visit Sir William Johnson. By letters from Albany dated the 8th of November, we are informed that a very large gathering of the chiefs of the Six Nations arrived at Sir William Johnson's estate on account of the late murder of 4 French traders by a party of Seneca Native Americans on Lake Ontario. So Sir William Johnson, he is a kind of like a British, or wealthy landowner, who formed a relationship with a lot of the Native American tribes, and will hold kind of peace gatherings with them, at his estate. This particular painting is actually, I think, from 1765, from a gathering that he had there. I use this because it kind of fits with the story and the best one that I could find. But this is now 8 years later, and he's still having meetings with the Native American tribes and the chiefs, to hash out any disputes or disagreements between them and the British colonists. The heads of the Confederacy have collected a good part of the peltry and are desirous to do all in their power for the satisfaction of the creditors. New York, again, November 22nd, 1773. To the doubters of the Ohio colony. Extract of a letter from London, September 7th. The exultations of those who never wished well to the new colony of Ohio are now at an end. They are convinced that in spite of all this late, newly exerted opposition to its existence, everything is certainly in the most promising way to its final conclusion, and that in all probability the next packet will carry to America proper documents for its establishment. So this is cool because at this time Ohio still isn't even a colony, um, and I don't believe it even becomes one until after the American Revolution. But we can see that one has been planned on the other side of the Ohio River, um, and they feel pretty confident that it would have been created if not for all of the turbulence that um, came with the American Revolution just a couple years later. New York, November 28th, 1773. Regiment of Welsh Fusiliers reviewed. On Friday last, His Majesty's Royal Regiment of Welsh Fusiliers, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Barnard, and the Royal Regiment of Artillery, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Cleveland, were reviewed by His Excellency Major General Haldimand, commanding in chief of His Majesty's forces in North America. So, this is kind of cool. We're there's a lot of information of these kind of troop reviews and other types of troop movements, and I want to kind of highlight these because, especially as we start to get into the American Revolution, it'll be very interesting to see where the different forces are situated and the movements of them to kind of track what's happening during this. Like, a lot of people, myself included, know a lot of the major beats of the American Revolution and the major battles, but I assume in these newspaper articles we're going to get a lot of small details that help to fill in the gaps between those major battles, which is going to be fascinating for myself to learn. Major General Haldimand, for those who know some of the history of the American Revolution, we know that um, this person must not be in his job for much longer, as we know that he's replaced by several generals who take control of the forces when the war begins. But for now, General Haldimand is the commander-in-chief of His Majesty's force in North America. There were present the governor and his lady, together with all the principal inhabitants of this city and its vicinities, who returned full of the most perfect satisfaction afforded by the brilliant appearance and animated maneuvers of these two gallant and finely appointed battalions. More military news. His Majesty's troop movements. By letters of good authority from England, we are informed that the 14th Regiment, now at St. Augustine, the 16th at Pensacola, and the 52nd at Quebec will be relieved next summer, and that the 4th, or King's Own, and the 5th regiments are ordered for that purpose. And we are likewise informed that for the future garrisons in the West Indies will be relieved by regiments doing duty in North America, which will be always supplied by fresh battalions from Great Britain and Ireland. Next week, His Excellency the General will set out for Philadelphia to review the Royal Regiments of Ireland, commanded by Major Hamilton, and on his return will visit the 47th Regiment at Perth Amboy. So, just seeing here, I don't know how many regiments England had under its control during this time. We know that England had a vast empire at this time, stretching into India and all the Caribbean islands and North America and Canada. But it's cool here to see that there's at least 52, which is a lot. Charlestown, November 28, 1773. Change in military organization. It is confidently asserted by some late papers that the military establishment on this continent will shortly undergo a considerable change, that there will be one establishment for the northern and one for the southern district of His Majesty's colonies. that the headquarters of the former are to be in New York, where the commander-in-chief is to reside, and for the latter in this town, which is to be honored with the presence of a brigadier general, and that all the troops to be sent out hereafter to be, all the troops to be sent out hereafter are to go to New York for the northern garrisons and to come here for the southern. So this is a cool thing for me to see written here in the newspaper, as during the American Revolution, Britain took control of New York City and pretty much was headquartered there for the majority of the war. Um, and then they also had that Southern campaign that kicked off, which makes sense that down in Charlestown was essentially the second headquarters for the British Army, and makes sense why they would then attempt to also um, bring some forces down there and try to take control of those regions. Um, and this was being thought about as early as November 28th, 1773 here. And that's it for the news of last week during 1773. I appreciate you for watching, and for anyone who made it to the end here. I hope you enjoyed learning about some of this old news, and check back next week for more stories from the past on It's Old News. I'll now leave a minute or two here with some old advertisements from some of the papers. Some of these are pretty interesting, and I'll probably try to include a few of these in each episode at the end, if I keep seeing some that are interesting. All right, well, thank you, and see you again.